Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about sectionalism and the build-up to the Civil War. If you are asked a question on the causes of the American Civil War, you definitely want to include the Mexican-American War and the debates over what to do with all this new land that they gained. But problems didn't start with this war, so I want us to go back in time and talk about some of those issues. If you remember when we discussed time period 4, we spent some time talking about the disagreements over tariffs. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the tariffs in this video, so if you don't remember a lot about them, go back and review them, but you should remember the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, leads South Carolina to try and nullify or cancel the tariff. This brings out the argument over states' rights versus a strong federal government, a problem you will continue to see as we keep discussing tensions between the North and the South. Another problem is that the South needs the North. They have no manufactured goods, so they are buying all of their products and stuff from the North. Also, their economy is one-dimensional, which means they only grow cash crops. Without buying stuff from the North, all the South would have is tobacco or cotton, and you can't live off of that alone. But the real issue we need to discuss is slavery. We've previously talked about the Mexican-American War and the issues surrounding the debate over slavery, so I'm going to skip over that part because we've talked about that a lot, although I wanted to leave it in this list because it is really, really important. So if you don't remember a lot about that, go back and look up the influence of the Mexican-American War on the debates over slavery. But we haven't yet talked about why slavery is so important to the South, other than just they need slaves for developing their cotton. Part of Southern society is still very medieval in thinking. They have a wealthy class that lived on plantations and owned slaves, and this was considered like the nobles. But only 25% of Southerners actually owned slaves. There was a bunch of poor white people who did not own slaves that were living in the South. Sometimes they were called white trash or hillbillies, but they also strongly supported slavery because it meant there was a group of people out there that they were also considered better than. Plus, they had the American dream of moving up in society one day, and in the South, that meant owning slaves. So even though poor whites are not benefiting financially from slavery, they still supported this system of slavery in the South. Slave owners needed slaves because they mostly grew cash crops. Remember, cotton is king in the South, and it accounted for 50% of their exports. Southerners also argued that slavery helped keep Black people under control in the South. Remember, they were terrified of slave rebellions like Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner. And they even tried to say that slavery was better than earning a small wage for hard labor in the South. Can you believe that? It's just mind-boggling. The argument was that Black people got to work in the fresh air and the sunlight. White Northerners were sweating. Women and children were stunted because they were working in those dark, stuffy factories. And if a slave got sick, they would argue that they were cared for, whereas Northern companies could just fire their employee and their employment wasn't guaranteed. So Southerners began to argue that slavery was a positive good. They encouraged slaves to become Christians and that they tried to convince people that they were treated like family. In some cases, very small cases, this was true, but definitely not everywhere. And again, it was slavery, so all of it is limiting their freedom and is all horrible. But during this time period, abolitionists worked tirelessly to end slavery, and this is especially true as abolitionism became bigger after the Second Great Awakening. They pointed out to people how cruel and harsh slavery was. They used examples of how families were split up and slaves were sold at auctions just like cattle. They argued that slave labor actually made less profit than just hiring someone else to do the job. Slaves did find small ways to rebel every day, such as working slow enough to cause problems, but fast enough to not be punished. Another argument abolitionists used was that banning slavery would only hurt a small percentage of Southerners. Remember, only 25% owned slaves, and many of them could afford to pay for labor instead. By this point, most Western countries like Great Britain had already abolished slavery, and there were several abolitionist groups that formed and worked towards ending slavery in the United States. We've already discussed a few of these, like the American Colonization Society, the founding of Liberia, where free Black people could go live free freely outside of America. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison begins writing The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. The American Anti-Slavery Society forms in 1833. And David Walker, a black abolitionist, writes his book asking for an end to white supremacy. But the greatest black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. He escaped from slavery in 1838 at the age of 21. He was a gifted speaker and writer. Many of you heard some of his speeches in my class. He wrote an autobiography of his life where he talked about his black mother and his white father, his struggle learning to read and write, and when it was forbidden to him in the South, and then he also wrote about his escape to the North. But eventually, most abolitionists turned to politics to help solve the issue of slavery. In 1840, the Liberty Party is formed, then the Free Soil Party in 1848 after the Mexican-American War, and then finally the Republican Party in 1854 after the issues in Kansas. The last thing I want to discuss under the abolitionist efforts to end slavery is the Gag Resolution. This is something that in 1836 was passed because Southerners were so tired of anti-slavery petitions arriving in Congress and in their mailboxes. Abolitionist pamphlets were just everywhere. So the House passed the Gag Resolutions, which required anti-slavery appeals to be put aside without any debate, meaning they weren't even allowed to discuss the issue of slavery in Congress. Can you believe that? It was illegal to discuss the issue of slavery in Congress under the Gag Resolutions. But John Quincy Adams, a former president, hated this so much that he came out of retirement and worked really hard to have this repealed, but it still takes him 8 years to do this. The last issue we need to discuss that leads to the Civil War is the issue of emotionalism. Slavery is the big issue. So if you're writing an essay on this idea of build up to the war or sectionalism, you absolutely have to discuss slavery. But the disagreements over slavery led to intense emotional feelings. These intense emotional feelings lead the South to want to secede, which then leads to the Civil War. It's like a quote from one of my favorite characters, Yoda. Are you ready?
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
But in this case, it's slavery leads to emotionalism, emotionalism leads to secession, and secession leads to war. Or I guess also suffering. Okay, it's better in the movie. I'm so glad that I could find a way to include Star Wars into these videos and for it to make sense. Now I just need to find a way to include some more Harry Potter. Wait, I'm actually wearing a Harry Potter sweater right now. Perfect. I did Star Wars and Harry Potter in one video. This might be the best one. Okay, so key events that lead to emotionalism. The first is the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a white woman living in the North who was really influenced by the Second Great Awakening and said God had inspired her to make sure Northerners knew of the cruelties of slavery. She especially focused on the way slavery split up families from each other. Millions of copies of her book were sold, and it was super influential in turning people against slavery. Abraham Lincoln once met her and said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." So as you can tell, this book was really popular across the United States. The Ostend Manifesto is the next one where the South secretly planned to take Cuba as a way to extend slavery. This upset the North so much that they don't go through with the plan, but this increases tensions between the two. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act allows popular sovereignty in the new territories, which makes people move there to influence the vote for or against slavery. This leads to violence and eventually the event known as Bleeding Kansas, where Lawrence, which is an anti-slavery town, is burned down by a pro-slavery group. Issues in Kansas also begin to influence Congress. In 1856, Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, gave a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," where he insulted South Carolina and one of their senators. I know you guys know this because we've talked about this in class a lot. Preston Brooks, one of the congressmen from South Carolina and cousin to that guy that Sumner insulted, was super offended. So later he found Sumner in his office, sitting behind his desk. Brooks walked in and pounded him with a cane until it broke. Southerners loved it and gifted Brooks new canes, some of them fancy with gold and everything. The North obviously found this as outrageous behavior, and even though Sumner was seriously injured and couldn't serve in Congress anymore after this, they elected him again as a symbol of this hatred. Politicians were supposed to be these model citizens for the United States, and now they are beating each other with canes. So this is a really good example to show how the emotion of this issue led to the Civil War. Then the Dred Scott decision occurs. Dred Scott was a slave who had traveled and lived with his master for several years in free states. He argued that since he had lived in free territory, he was no longer a slave. But the Supreme Court rules that black slaves are not citizens, so they could not even sue in federal courts. And they took it a step further and basically made the Missouri Compromise illegal, saying that no state has the right to deny a person of their property, meaning that even if a slave was living in a free state, they were still property. The Supreme Court, who was made up of more Southerners at this time, was basically saying that slavery is legal everywhere in the United States. As you can imagine, this upsets the North and undermines the compromises they had previously created to keep the balance between the states and the peace between the two regions. Then, in the same year, Hinton Rowan Helper wrote the book The Impending Crisis of the South. He lived in the South and wasn't wealthy, so he did not own slaves. He actually didn't like slavery and didn't really like black people. But he did try to argue that slavery was bad for poor whites in the South. He wanted to get poorer whites to join the cause of abolitionism, but the wealthy whites in the South banned the book. So it didn't really work. But the book did become popular in the North, which upset the South even further. Then, in 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate as they run for the Senate seat in Illinois. Lincoln lost the election, but gained a huge moral victory and became super famous around the country for his ability to apply logic to his argument. After the debates where he argued that more was needed than popular sovereignty to end slavery, people began to see Lincoln as someone who believes in true racial equality. He denied this early on, but now the South saw Lincoln as a threat to slavery. After this debate, John Brown, remember he was the guy who led an attack in Kansas where they brutally killed 5 pro-slavery people. Well, he's back, and he leads a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. He and about 20 other people take over a federal arsenal where they have weapons supplied. The plan was to distribute these weapons to the slaves and lead an uprising, and eventually have a place where black people could live freely. Well, he accidentally kills 7 innocent people. I'm not sure how accidentally that could be, but it happens, and he's caught pretty quickly by the Marines. Plus, slaves didn't know about his plan, so they didn't join him, so not the greatest planning. It failed, and he was executed, but for some in the North, he becomes a martyr and a symbol of someone who was willing to do anything to stop slavery. Although there were many Northerners who thought this tactic was way too extreme. The South saw this as every person's plan in the North, and again, this leads to more tensions between the two regions. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected as the 16th president of the United States. Lincoln is now part of this new Republican Party, and the South sees this as the final straw, and 7 states actually secede even before Lincoln takes office. Remember, there is a few months in between the time after the election and before the next president takes over, but the South felt that it was too late at this point, and they create their own new government called the Confederate States of America and choose their own president, a guy named Jefferson Davis. There was one last final chance at creating peace called the Crittenden Compromise. The plan was very supportive of slavery to help make Southerners happy and keep them in the Union. It would extend the 3630 line all the way across the territories gained from Mexico and ban slavery above it, but allow slavery below it. And any future states would get to choose if they wanted slavery or not, which means that new territories, like if we gained Cuba, for example, would most likely be pro-slavery territories. It was very generous to the South and maybe could have stopped the Civil War. Lincoln decides to reject this, and it never comes about. And he rejects it because he ran as an anti-slavery party, and he felt he was morally obligated to uphold those ideas and vetoed it. So with this failure, war begins. Okay, your practice question today is an LEQ prompt, and it is evaluate the extent to which the Mexican-American War marked a turning point in the debate over slavery in the United States, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period before the war to the period after it. So take some time to write down, outline how you would answer this question. What would be your context? What would be your thesis? What would be some evidence you would use? Make sure you think about the before and the after, because that's really important in a prompt like this, because it's asking you specifically what changed and what stayed the same. After you do that, check out the potential responses in the video description below, and I hope you guys have a great day. And if you saw my dogs moving in and out of the background of the video, I apologize, or maybe it kept you really entertained. I don't know. See you guys in class.